Thank you. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. So, did the food coma kicks in? Somewhat. Okay. So, as you see, I'm going to talk about leveling up your gamification to solve big business problem. But because I know that all of you have a big lunch and you're all probably a little bit getting affected by the food coma, so let's play a little bit of a gamification trivia. Okay? So let me ask you guys, what are the most common business use case of gamification? So you've seen a lot of use case for gamification this morning. There's, in education, health and fitness, there's probably, many application gamification. But what's the most common in business? Shout it out. It's okay. E-commerce. And what else? Sales. And what else? Communication. Customer engagement. Learning. What else? Health. Right? That's not business. That's health, right? Okay. These are very good answer, okay? So basically, the three common use cases in business is one, deepens engagement. The second one is to sustain loyalty. And the third one is onboarding new user, okay? Those are the three most common use cases for gamification in the business world. So you could apply this internally, right? In the internal world, you would call, deepen engagement, employee collaboration, okay? And you would call, loyalty is obviously loyalty to the company, right, for your employees. And third case, where onboarding users really just employee onboarding. And you could also apply this externally to customers, okay? Now, customers are obviously under no obligation to engage, right? So obviously it's actually a much harder problem. So in that case, deepen engagement really means customer collaboration or customer co-creation. And there's also a loyalty to a brand and also learning. So people talk about learning, right? So those are the three common use cases. So let me ask you guys. So can I have the lights up? And then I wanted to ask you guys, how well do you think these use cases are working? How many think it works really well? Raise your hand. Nobody think it worked well? Why are you guys here? Okay. All right. Okay. So, let me ask you guys another question then. Okay. So, does any of you participate in any travel-based loyalty program? Okay. So, why don't you guys stand up? Stand up if you participate in any travel loyalty program, right? Whether it is a frequent flyer program or a hotel loyalty program. Okay, good. So there's a lot of people here, right? So this is actually the data that I get from surveying a lot of people. No, keep it standing, right? Don't sit down yet, okay? You're not done, I'm giving you a test, right? So almost everybody have some kind of loyalty program. As you heard this morning, right, on average, people have 21 loyalty cards in their pocket, right? Now, let me ask you another question. How many of you have more than one travel loyalty program? More than one. Keep on standing, okay? If you're standing, okay? So some of you sit down, okay? But a lot of you remain standing. And this is the same kind of data I've seen as well, okay? About 88% of them has more than one loyalty program. But what does that say about people's loyalty? Now you can sit down, okay? What does it say about people's loyalty? It means that those people who are standing, they're not really loyal, right? If you have more than one loyalty program, if you're loyal to United and Delta, you're actually loyal to neither. All right? So what that means is that from the data, we're seeing that between this graph and this graph, there's only about 10% of the people who are truly, truly loyal, right? So the truly loyal, engaged population is very small. Okay, so a lot of you know that Gartner published the hype cycle on gamification you published a hype cycle report characterizing gamification as an emerging technology in 2011. But not very many of you know that Gartner also published a report the year after they published the hype cycle, saying that about 80% of the currently gamified application will fail. Okay? That's extremely high failure rate. Why do you think that is? So the thing is that gamification almost always work for short-term problem. Okay? If you are a game designer, right, you could design a really, really stupid game, right? Let's design a game that, we just toss this paper, rolled up paper into the trash can. Valid game, right? Some of you will play for 5 minutes and 10 minutes, right? Maybe half an hour. But you probably would not play for a week or a month or a year, right? So any game is able to engage people in the short term. So gamification works really well for these short-term business problems. But the biggest problem, the most challenging problem in the business world are long-term. So for those problems, they don't work very well, okay? So I don't want to give it a thumb down, okay? But it's like a sideways thumb, okay? So it doesn't work very well. Some of the time it works, sometimes it doesn't. And it's not clear why it doesn't work, okay? So, but we also know that good games are very, very engaging. Great games are even addictive, even over a long period of time, many, many years, okay? So let's take a look at some of the most addictive games out there, say like Angry Bird. Anybody play Angry Bird? Raise your hand, don't be shy. I play Angry Bird, right? All right? I play it for research. What do you play it for? All right. I play for fun sometimes too. All right. So you know that Angry Bird is very addictive, right? So how does it get people into this kind of addictive behavior, right? So you know Angry Bird, you have this immediate feedback, right? Immediately you have control. You can control the angle. You have physics, right? When you knock things, they actually falls down. You also have points, right? When you knock things down, you immediately get the points, right? These are all immediate feedback. When you do something, you get the feedback right away. And then there's also leveling up. There's level up, unlocking the levels. There's also, later on you find that there's different kind of material, different kind of bird, different kind of birds actually breaks different kind of material, right? There's also different kind of pigs that you could knock out, right? And then there's also a leaderboard that you could compare to your friends. So basically, all these game mechanics together is what brings you into a state of flow, all right? So what is the state of flow? How many people are psychologists here? Right? You probably know what flow is, okay? So, but flow is a mental state that's identified by a renowned psychologist by the name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So Mihaly, that's actually the correct way to pronounce his name. So I actually went to a conference with him, and this guy, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, at USC, he's a professor there now. It's very interesting. He basically started the talk before he even start his talk, he says that I know that every one of you will have a question by the end of my talk. Is that how the hell you pronounce your name? So I'm going to answer that first. So he actually answered that question, and then he said, my name is pronounced Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So that's actually the correct way to pronounce it. So he actually identified this optimal state of intrinsic motivation. Right? That's a state when you're in the zone. You are so immersed in what you do that you forget about time. You forget about the fact that you're hungry. You forget about the time that, the fact that you're tired. Right? You're just so in the zone, so immersed in what you do, that you forget about everything. So that's the state he identified. But what's amazing is that Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi not only identified that mental state, he also identified the precondition that's necessary to go into that state. And that is basically this challenge that you face have to match your skill, okay? If you look at this graph right here, okay? Pointer is not very strong, so if your skill is pretty low compared to your challenge, right? Then you get into this state of boredom. You get pretty bored, right? If this challenge is too great compared to your skill, then you also get kind of frustrated, right? You get into an anxious state because you can't finish it, right? So flow is really this very fine line between certainty and uncertainty. People love to have certainty, right? How many people like uncertain things? Not very many people like. Some people do, right? But believe it or not, people actually do like that, right? People like certainty, so they like to be in this control state, right? But if it's too much control they could do this thing with their eyes closed. They have so much control. They master it so much. then they also feel bored. They don't like that, right? People like a little bit of uncertainty too, right? People like to be challenged. A little bit of unknown is good, but when there's too much uncertainty, then they get frustrated as well, right? So flow is this really fine line between certainty and uncertainty. But what people often don't recognize is that people's skill is not static. People's skill actually changes over time, okay? So you may be in the state of flow right now, but over time, you move into the state of boredom. Why? Because you get better at what you do over time, right? People learn. People get more skill, acquire more skill, then get more ability. So they move into this state of boredom. So how do you fix that? How do you fix this problem? What? Yeah, challenge them more, right? Exactly. So just challenge them more. So just give them a task that's more challenging. Very good. But in real life, it's actually very difficult to find a task that's just right, with the right just amount of challenge to move you back in the flow. Your boss probably say, if you finish a big project, your boss probably say, good job. Now just do the same thing again, right? So that's, or you say, well, that's the same thing again, so it's still kind of boring, right? But sometimes your boss will say, okay, now, good job. Now we're going to scale this to 5 neighboring countries. Then you're going to say, holy crap, that's kind of hard, right? So now, if it's a little bit too hard, kind of like this, right? Just a little bit too hard, then it's okay. Because what that means is that you have to have you have a shallow learning curve, right? You have to acquire a little bit more skill in order to move back into flow. Okay? You just have to acquire, you have a shallow learning curve, then you move back into flow. Now, but very often your boss will say, now, good job, we're actually going to scale this to the entire world. Then you're going to say, oh, shit. Right? That's like this, right? This is like, you have a steep learning curve. Basically, it's way too hard, then you have to get a lot of skill in order to move you back to flow. That means it's going to take you a long time, right, to move back into flow. Okay, so even though people love to be in this state of flow, people don't often experience it because it's actually very difficult in real life to have the challenge that just meets your skill. Now, there's actually one industry that's mastered getting people in flow. Getting people in flow, okay? See? Getting people in flow. You got any guess on what that industry might be? Gaming industry, exactly. So good games are designed to maximize flow. How do you think it does that? How do you think it does that? It does that by zigzagging along this flow zone, right? You have a question? No? Okay. All right, we will save the question to the end, okay? So you zigzag along this flow zone. Basically what that means is that as soon as you start to get bored, they move you into the next level. And then, when you start to get bored there again, they move you into the next level. So that's how games do it, right? But if you are a game designer, what would you have to do to achieve that? What would you have to do in order to achieve this kind of result? Basically, you have to control the level of difficulty in a very, very specific way, okay? So basically, this specific way is this, right? Game designer have to control the level of difficulty in this way, such that the next step that the player takes is always a baby step relative to the skill they acquire, okay? So the relative to the skill they acquire is key. Relative to the skill they acquire is the key, okay? It's not that every step has to be a baby step. If every step is a baby step, what will happen? People get bored very quickly, right? And people quit. So what that means is that you have to design this thing such that every step is relative to the skill they acquire is a baby step. What does that mean? Let me show you what that means. What that means is that if this could be the next step right here. This step is a very big step right here. Right? As you can see, the skill gap gets bigger and bigger here. This step is a very big step. But relative to the skill they already acquire, it's a baby step. You see that? Now, if that's not clear, let me illustrate this with an example. This is Angry Bird level 100. Anybody pass this level? Remember this level? Okay. Now, if you never play Angry Bird level 1 to level 99, this level would look like impossible to you. It's a very difficult step, right? But if you have played Angry Bird level 0 to level 99, then this exact same level will look very, very easy to you. Why? Because when you play level 1 to level 99, you acquire skill. You learn how to play the game better, right? Therefore, the same level, this very difficult level right here, this very big step, looks very achievable. And that's how games are able to get people into this behavioral addiction. All right? Okay. So now that's how people design addictive games. How do you design gamification that get people into this state? Now, there's actually a lot of gamification tools out there, right? There's like hundreds, if not like probably even thousands of gamification tools out there, right? Different kinds of points, badges, different variants of badge, different variants of reputation, so on and so forth. I highlighted 7 here, but there's actually many, many more. Now, you can actually organize these gamification tools according to their feedback time scale, okay? The feedback time scale is basically how quickly does gamification tool feedback the performance data back to the user. All right? So you can see that points are immediate, as I said before with the Angry Bird, right? When you did something, when you knock something down, you get those points right away. It's immediate, right? But what about badges? Badges have a slower feedback time scale because they have to reach a certain threshold before they will give you a badge, right? So the feedback time scale of badges is slower. And leaderboards is even slower, and so on and so forth, right? So with the right-hand side of this spectrum, right, with team reputation, the feedback time scale could be even years. Now, this is actually a very useful tool. It's called the gamification spectrum, right? Basically, it's actually dependent on the behavior, what kind of behavior you're trying to drive. If you are trying to drive a very easy behavior, right, then this whole spectrum compresses. This whole spectrum actually compresses down because now people's going to get points, because behavior is easier, people's going to be able to get the points faster, they're going to reach that threshold faster to get the badges faster, right? So the whole spectrum compresses. If you're trying to drive some behavior that's very difficult, then this whole spectrum actually stretches out, right? Because now it takes you longer to get those points and longer to get those badges, so it takes you longer, so this whole spectrum stretches out. The key thing to recognize is that the order of these tools actually don't change. The order of these tools actually don't change. That's the important thing. But, okay, so this spectrum actually depends on the behavior that you're trying to drive, but it also depends on the user's ability. How much skill does the user have? If the user is very, very proficient, have a lot of skill, a lot of ability, then, of course, the spectrum also compresses, right? Because if you have more skill, is it going to complete the task much faster? Right? So the feedback will be faster, so the whole spectrum compresses again. And if, again, the user have less ability, don't have a lot of ability, then the whole spectrum actually stretches out. Okay, now, this spectrum is actually very useful. Let me show you some use case. How do you actually use this spectrum right here? Okay, so first, let's take a look at some of the property on the tools on the left-hand side. The tools on the left-hand side, they typically use to gamify a single user action, okay? And the type of metric that they use is actually a single accumulative metric. And on the right-hand side, you start to gamify very complex action, okay? Very complex behavior, and the metric is actually very complex. And the middle is somewhere in between, right? He's trying to use single user and frequency type of metric. And as a result, the tools on the left-hand side, they're very easy to game. People could game it, okay? Because why? Because the user have full control of their actions, right? So they can actually game the system. And the right-hand side, because it actually involves many, many actions, maybe even other people, so it's very difficult to game the tools on the right-hand side. As a result, right, the tools on the left-hand side are actually more biased, okay? They're actually not a fair comparison, whereas the tools on the right are actually much more fair, much more a real fair comparison, a characterization of the people's skill. Now, as a result, these tools on the left-hand side, they are meant to feed back to the user himself, whereas the tools on the right-hand side are meant to feed back to the rest of the community and beyond the community as well. Okay, So let's take a look at couple more properties of these tools, right? The tools on the left-hand side are basically, because they're very easy to game, right? So they actually are all the reward that you can get from these tools are very extrinsic. The tools on the right-hand side actually offers intrinsic reward. And therefore, the tools on the left-hand side are actually not sustainable over long term. And the tools on the right-hand side are actually sustainable over very, very long term. Okay? So let's actually try to use this spectrum to address some question that we have in the industry. So for example, why do you think that most gamification in the industry look like pointers or badgers and leaderboards? Why? If you look at this spectrum, right? Points are actually here, badges right, leaderboards right here, right? And these tools basically use metrics that are very, very simple. So that's why, because these tools are very easy to implement. The tools on the right-hand side are much, much more difficult to implement. Okay? So that's why, because these are easy. That's why everything that's cookie cutter in the industry looks like these. All right? Let's try to use this to answer another question. Right? We heard that gamification should not be just about competition. Right? Most of the gamification in the industry are very focused on competitive, characterized as competition. While some of the biggest challenge in life is a collaborative effort. How do you answer that question? Why? Why is that the case? Well, on the left-hand side of the spectrum, it's actually more competitive. But as you can see, on the right-hand side of the spectrum, people have to start to be more cooperative, right? There are actually a lot of gamification consultancies actually out there promoting cooperative games, right? And so competition and cooperativity are actually both important. But they're important at different stages of the game, right? At the beginning, you want people to compete, right? As people compete, they recognize what's their strengths and weaknesses, and they basically start to realize that they are actually unique, right? Everybody have different strengths and weaknesses. And then they can actually start to collaborate, right? And start cooperating with each other. So another question that I often get asked in the industry is that, should gamification rule be explicit, right? Or should it be hidden and obscure? What do you think? Have you get asked that question? Well, on the left-hand side of the spectrum, it should be more explicit because these are very simple games, right? So on the right-hand side, it should be more obscure. And this is a related question, is that are surprises good or bad? Are surprises good in games? On the left-hand side of the spectrum, when you're just learning how to play, surprises is actually frustrating, right? But if you learn how to play the game, right, already, on the right-hand side of the spectrum, surprises is actually pleasant, right? It gets rid of that boredom, right? It's less boring when you have surprises, right? So now, as you can see, this gamification spectrum is very useful, but how do we use this to solve big business problem, long-term business problem? Well, let's take a look at another property, right? The other property you have to look at is basically, think of the tools on the left-hand side are easy game to achieve, and the tools on the right-hand side are very difficult game to achieve. Now, the easy games, one of the benefits of having an easy game is that they're quick to motivate people. They act very fast. So it engages a lot of people. But what's the downside of having an easy game? People master them very quickly, right? And what happens when people master them? People stop playing, right? Because it's boring. So it stops working after a while, very quickly, right? On the other end of the spectrum, where you have a game that's very difficult, people never master them. But because they're difficult, they actually are very slow to motivate people, right? As a result, they only engage a very few people. Only those people who are extremely motivated or extremely passionate about the game will play the game, okay? So basically, we have a couple more properties, right? We know the tools on the left-hand side, they have faster effect and engage a lot of people, but they also stop working faster. On the tools on the right-hand side, they have slower effect and engage a few people, but they actually, doesn't continue to work for a long time. So how do you pick a tool to solve your business, the long-term business problem? How do you do that? Well, this gamification spectrum is so useful that we actually patented it. And actually, we were awarded a patent about a month ago. So it's actually a testament that had its utility. And so the trick is that you learn from the game designers, right? First, you give them points. Once they start to get a hang of points, then you say that, okay, once you get like, 10 point, 100 point, then you start to get bored getting points, right? Then you say, you give them badges, right? When you had your first badge, you say, oh, I'm cool, that I get something different, right? Not just points anymore, I'm getting something different, I get a badge. And then once you get your second or third or fifth badge, then you be still motivated, but when you get your 20th badge, you start to get tired. I get like 10 of those already, or I got 15 of those already, I'm not really interested. Then you actually show them that, your neighbor, Bob, is actually on the leaderboard and you're not. And then you say, what, my neighbor, Bob, is on the leaderboard and I'm not? Well, I've got to do more, right? So you get them to play a game of successively longer and longer feedback time scale, right? And to the point where they will actually have very, very deep engagement with you, long-term engagement, right? So anybody know, what's the success rate of launching a community? So Lithium actually launches community for large companies. So Gartner actually published a lot of stuff. One of the statistics they published in 2012 is that 70% of the community launch in a while actually fails, okay? But this is not the data that we see. What we see is that we actually see 90% success rate, right, from our customers. And so that's actually, why it shows the power of this baby step leveling up approach, okay? So now the remaining question is good, now we find a way to level up this gamification, right? To get people to do these things for much, much longer time scale. Where do you stop? Where do you stop? That actually requires another concept, another time scale, right? And that's called the effective time scale. So the effective time scale is basically how long is your gamification, the behavior that you're trying to gamify intended to last, okay? So let me illustrate some effective time scale for a common business problem, okay? So if you could use gamification to drive social media engagement, say like at this conference, so conference participation, engagement. How long does the conference last? So this conference lasts 4 days, right? So probably on the order of a few days, right? Some are 1 day, some are 3 days, some are 4 days, some are 5 days, right? So the effective time scale is basically in the order of a few days. Now, you could also use gamification to onboard employees. How long does it take you to onboard an employee in different companies? Probably on the order of a few weeks, right? Right? I mean, depending on how complex your product is, right? Some company may sell really complex product, then they may have a lot of process and they need to onboard them for maybe a few weeks or maybe even a month, right? So what about marketing campaign? You could also use gamification to drive engagement to a marketing campaign. And typically, how long does a marketing campaign last? Month, right? Probably on a few months, right? So you can also use it to drive community co-creation. Community co-creation is actually much harder. It takes on the order of years to several years, right? A few years. You can also use it to drive loyalty. Okay? Loyalty is inherently a long-term concept, right? You cannot be loyal to a company for only 1 month. That's not loyal, right? So basically, loyalty, the effective time scale is many, many years. All right? So now, we know that tools that have short feedback time scale, right, they work faster, but they also stop working faster. But we also know, so the trick is really to build a ladder with successively longer feedback time scale, right? So basically, if you're trying to use gamification to drive conference participation, basically all you need is points and badges is probably sufficient. Now, if you want to onboard employees, then a leaderboard may help, right? If you want to basically use it to drive marketing engagement with the marketing campaign, then you probably need trophies. And if you want to drive community co-creation, then you probably need ranks and all that stuff. If you want to drive loyalty, which lasts many, many years, then you will need the whole spectrum. Okay? So remember earlier I asked you guys, How many of you actually have more than one loyalty program with the airline or hotel? A lot of you have more than one, right? What does that mean? What that means is that you're not loyal. You're not truly loyal. If you're truly loyal, you would just pick one and be loyal to that, right? But what are these status with hotels and airlines anyway? They basically are badges, right? When you fly with the airline or stay at a hotel, you get those points right away. You get the mile right away, right? But after you reach some threshold, then you get a status. You get a silver status, a gold status, and so on and so forth, right? So that's, even though they call this status, but effectively, functionally, they are really just badges, okay? So as you can see, why does current loyalty program don't work very well? It's because they're not using this full spectrum. They're only using the first two rungs of the spectrum. And they expect you to engage with them long term, right? Okay, so make no mistake, I'm not saying that the current loyalty doesn't work, okay? It does work, right? It does drive repeat purchase. It does increase revenue. But if you do use the whole spectrum, it could work much, much better, okay? It could work very much, much better. Basically, your loyal population is not going to be just 10%. It's going to be probably at least 25% or more, right? You increase your advocacy and increase your revenue much, much more, and probably have a lot of additional benefits as well, right? So what's the formula to use gamification to solve these big, long-term business problems? Well, it's 3-step, right? First, you have to identify the effective time scale of the game you're trying to solve. Effective time scale of the behavior that you're trying to drive. So is that 2 months, or is it a year, or is it 10 years? What is it, okay? Then you want to find a gamification tool that has a feedback time scale that's approximately equal to the effective time scale that you're trying to drive, okay? So it could be any tool. I call it like gamification tool X, right? It could be anything, right? Like I said, there's many, many tools out there in the industry. And then you want to build the ladder, right? By filling the gaps between. And the key thing to recognize is that you always want to start with immediate feedback, okay? And you must fill all the gaps. You can't skip any rung. If you skip any rung, there's one step that's very difficult for people to climb up, and then people will stop playing, right? Actually, a lot of people will stop playing. The truly motivated people will continue to play, but there will be a smaller population, okay? So, but also, you don't have to fill up the entire ladder all at once, okay? You just have to fill up the ladder faster than your player climbs up this ladder, okay? And then finally is that you have to measure your player's progress and use the data to actually fill up the remaining part of the ladder. So you can actually design this first 2 or 3 rung of the ladder, and then just watch the data, watch how fast your player climb up, and then design the rest of them as you go. So with that, Lithium actually got a patent. I actually got a patent plaque. So that's it. So that's the formula of how you use gamification to solve long-term business problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.